This is the second reading for Philosophy 110P, Introduction to Philosophy. We're dealing again with knowledge. Epistemology is the branch of philosophy dealing with knowledge, right? Dealing with the nature of knowledge, which is the definition of knowledge, the conditions necessary and sufficient for knowledge. It deals with the scope of knowledge, the limits of knowledge, and the sources of knowledge, how we know, whether we need the sense experience or whether we can arrive at knowledge through reason alone or through intuition or faith, ESP, and so on. And so we're dealing with the subject of the branch of philosophy known as epistemology, and we're dealing with, more specifically, with radical skepticism. In the first lecture, we saw a defense of radical skepticism by Unger. This lecture is called a critique of skepticism, and this critique of skepticism is from John Hospers, who was an English-speaking philosopher who was pretty influential, and he wrote on many different areas in philosophy, including epistemology especially, but also political philosophy. He, among other things, he was a libertarian, and as a matter of fact, I believe was the first candidate for the U.S. presidency who ran on the libertarian ticket. But in any event, Hospers here is criticizing radical skepticism. And John Hospers, so he's written this, a critique of skepticism, and it's in response to people like such as Peter Unger, right? And so Unger, by the way, there were radical skeptics who lived in ancient Greece, for example, but Unger is a very modern guy. By the way, modern philosophy starts with Descartes, and that's a complicated story, who lived in the 16th century, early 17th century. But the fact of the matter is, I use the term loosely. When Unger is a modern, you could almost say contemporary, but he lived, he was born in the 20th century. Okay, so Unger is defending skepticism, right? And yet Hospers is writing a criticism of it. So what Hospers does is, first, he talks about what he calls propositional knowledge, and giving us some sort of analysis of what propositional knowledge is, or what the conditions are that will be necessary and sufficient for propositional knowledge. So first question, what is a proposition according to philosophy, right? Okay, so we could say loosely, but for our purposes adequately, that different sentences, and even different sentences from different languages, can express the same thing, or what we call the same proposition. For example, es regnet, it is raining in German, or it is raining. Okay, so the same proposition can be expressed in different ways, even using different languages. The proposition is that which is expressed. The proposition is supposed to be something that can be true or false. Okay, so we're talking about propositional knowledge as opposed to, let's say, how-to knowledge, how to do something. So propositional knowledge, it would be knowledge that would involve our beliefs. Okay, now let's say what does he say? That is to say, what does Hosper say is a good example of propositional knowledge? Well, he says there have to be three criteria. He says if you know some proposition P, first of all, P should be true, must be true. If you know that you are in Virginia Beach, Virginia, it has to be true that you're in Virginia Beach. Okay, you can't know you're in Virginia Beach if you are elsewhere. Okay, so he calls this the objective requirement of knowledge. This isn't controversial, though, by the way. That's not controversial to say if you know something, it has to be true. Okay, so that's the objective requirement of knowledge, which relates to the object of knowledge. It says the object of knowledge, we'll just say the proposition in this case, has to be true. Second, he says that the knower must believe that which is supposed to be known. So if you know you're in Virginia Beach, Virginia, that means that you have to believe it. You can't know you're in Virginia Beach, Virginia, even if you believe you're elsewhere, if you believe you're in Richmond, Virginia. Okay, so he says, okay, so if you know something, it has to be true. That's the objective requirement of knowledge. If you know something, you have to believe it. He calls that the subjective requirement of knowledge. Why? because it relates to the knower's subjective state. And it says that this has to do with, if you like, the contents of your mind, if you like. But it says that if you know something, then you have to believe it. You can't know that you are, again, in Virginia Beach, if you believe you're elsewhere. And third and finally, Hospers says in his analysis of propositional knowledge that if you know a proposition, that you must have adequate or sufficient evidence for believing it's true. But he says if you have all three, you believe something that's true on the basis of adequate or sufficient evidence, then he says you know it. Okay, so let's just say, do rocks exist? Well, if I believe correctly they exist on the basis of adequate or sufficient evidence, then I know they exist. And he thinks we know that rocks exist. Okay? Now, what's going to happen is Hospers admits that we can definitely be mistaken about things that we think are true, and maybe sometimes we think they're obviously true, but we're mistaken. That can easily be true. But he says we usually can correct ourselves if we're mistaken, and that we can know all sorts of things, including things about the physical world. So Hospers has no problem at all with the belief that we know the physical world exists and we know that rocks exist. And he believes that the radical skeptic is misusing doubt. See, Hospers says if you know something, you need grounds for your knowledge. Okay, that's not controversial. But he says also doubt requires grounds. He says doubt requires a basis, and not anything can constitute a basis. If you have concrete and actual evidence that's connected to the doubt, okay, that's a good thing. But if the doubt is designed to overturn a belief that we're supposed to have great evidence for, but the doubt itself is based on something that is a product of the imagination, something that is very far from being known, something for which we have no actual or concrete evidence, then Hospers says that's an illegitimate doubt. That is a doubt that is not well grounded, and therefore it cannot overturn something for which we have lots of evidence. And of course, Hospers would say we have lots of evidence that rocks exist. Lots of evidence. And so he's going to say we would need some really strong evidence to overturn all the evidence that we have. And if someone says, well, how do I know that somebody's not messing with my mind? He goes, well, that's not good enough. Do you have concrete evidence that someone's messing with your mind? And then Unger goes, well, that's it. He's just so good, or she's so good, this brain scientist, that, well, this person is undetectable. Well, Hospers says that's not a basis to overturn something for which we have such strong evidence as a belief in rocks. Okay, so again, Hospers is going to say that we know a proposition. We have all three conditions met. And he's going to argue that we know that in the case of rocks. Okay. Now, interestingly, Hospers complicates matters. He hasn't so far as I can tell, but he does complicate matters in his essay, because he ends up drawing a distinction that in fact is I think somewhat controversial. It's certainly not something that a lot of philosophers believe, or even a lot of philosophers may be familiar with. Okay, but there were people during his time, that is during the time of Hospers, who were drawing a distinction between knowledge in the strong sense and knowledge in the weak sense. And I think traditionally there hasn't been such a distinction. And I'm not convinced that we even need to make it, but in any event, apparently Hospers thought it was a worthwhile distinction. So what's the distinction? Hospers says we have knowledge in the strong sense. We're entitled to believe some proposition under all future conditions, even when the future conditions and experience seem to contradict that proposition. And you might ask, well, what sorts of things does he think we know in the strong sense? Well, I think he gives us bad examples. He's typically quoting from other philosophers, but I think he's giving us bad examples, because all of his examples are tied to physical perception in people's current environment. So one example is that of an ink bottle. Now, I don't have an ink bottle, but I have a water bottle. In fact, it's a water bottle that has got lemon juice in it. I like to drink water with lemon. So pretend this, we don't have to pretend. This water bottle is in front of me, let's say. I'm touching it now, but suppose it were just sitting in front of me. He gives example, well, he's quoting from someone else, an example of an ink bottle. And he says, suppose you seem to see an ink bottle clearly and distinctly, just as I seem to see this clearly and distinctly, right? But, say it's sitting in front of me. Okay? Well, suppose, it doesn't matter whether it's a water bottle or an ink bottle, but what he says is, and then he's quoting from someone else, but with approval. Someone says, look, I clearly and distinctly, at least seem to clearly and distinctly perceive this ink bottle. Now notice, they're just using one of our senses, even though it's a very important one, vision. Okay, so, and then he says, and he's quoting from someone else though, suppose that you appear at the next moment after you see it to run your hand through it. You're still entitled to say, well, it must have been there a moment ago, right? Or suppose you, it doesn't matter, or ink bottle or water, I'll just go with an ink bottle, that's an example. So the ink bottle, you seem to run your hand through it. Or suppose you want to pick it up and then it's not there, and then all of a sudden you're not even in that room, you're elsewhere, outside under a tree, and there's no ink bottle. Okay. And then he's again quoting from someone else. Suppose someone takes a picture of your desk and it shows everything but the ink bottle. He says, well, first of all, you could think that you were being fooled later. You could think there's a trick camera if someone took a picture and it showed everything but the ink bottle. Okay. Or if you seem to run your hand through it, you could think you were hallucinating. Then I think all that's very, very weak. Why? Well, because why do you think, if you seem to use one of your senses, vision, and just for a very short time you seem to see something, but then everything else contradicts it, including other senses, why, on what basis could you say with authority you must have been correct a moment ago? And I think that you wouldn't have a good basis for it. And so I think these are very bad examples of if there is knowledge in the strong sense, of what knowledge in the strong sense is. Again, remember, he wants to, it's interesting because Hospers, just like there are super doubters out there, the radical skeptics, it's as if Hospers is saying, well, we can have super certainties. And in the end, he gives us examples that are supposed to constitute super certainties that I think are not good examples. I mean, let's suppose that you seem to see an ink bottle in front of you, and then you hear an alarm clock, and then your eyes open, you're in bed, and there's no ink bottle, and things are even clearer then than they were before when you thought you saw an ink bottle. Wouldn't you say, well, I'm really mistaken? And then if you were trying to lift the ink bottle, and then you're outside and there's no ink bottle, wouldn't you say, I don't know what to believe? So I think these are just not really good examples at all, examples of what seems to be in your immediate physical environment, and then what you see, use one sense to, I just don't think, he gives another example, and that is he's in his office, and he's got books and bookcases, as I do, behind me, and he says, I'm watching, I say, as knowledge and strong. So, well, I agree that while you're watching them, you're going to believe they exist, most likely. But then he goes, well, I walk out in the hallway for several minutes, and then to the degree that I know they're still there, that's knowledge in the weak sense, because I could go back into the room and they could not be there. And so we say that's knowledge in the weak sense. It's the same proposition that there are books in your office, but your relation to it is different. Now I agree that while you're looking at the books, you're going to believe they're there, right? And you need to have some reason for thinking they're not there. And I understand that. But this idea that no matter what happens, this example with the ink bottle, that you seem to see it in front of you, right? But a moment later, all the evidence counts against it. You seem to run your hand through it, or you try to pick it up and you're outside, there's no ink bottle. It seems to me that it's highly implausible that you could say with authority that you were not mistaken earlier. It seemed to me it doesn't make sense to say these are great examples of knowledge in the strong sense. That is to say, beliefs we're entitled to have regardless of future experience. Now, if there is knowledge in the strong sense, and I'm not convinced that there is, but if there is, it wouldn't be anything related to our immediate perceptions of our physical environment. Rather, it would be things like rocks exist, because it would take a lot for you to give up a belief that rocks exist. You could not believe any longer there's a rock in front of you, right? If some of the things happen Hospers was talking about. Or if you try to pick up the rock and you hear an alarm clock, your eyes open and you're in bed and there are no rocks around and everything's clearer than it was a moment ago. Okay, so it seems to me that that if there is knowledge in the strong sense, that is to say, a belief you're entitled to have regardless of future evidence, it's going to have to be something like rocks exist, or if you want to take it even to a higher, more abstract level, the physical world exists. Because just think about it. What's going to get you to disbelieve that the physical world has existed? But in any event, I'm just not so sure how useful it is to talk about the distinction between knowledge in the strong sense and knowledge in the weak sense, rather than just talking about knowledge. But if you're going to talk about knowledge in the strong sense and you want to identify it as Hospers does with beliefs we're entitled to have regardless of future evidence, I do not believe that the examples that Hospers gives, and typically he's quoting from other people, that is to say, examples that are connected to our perception and especially our use of vision of things that appear to be in our immediate physical environment. I don't believe that those examples are good examples of things we're entitled to believe regardless of future evidence, even when the evidence appears obviously to contradict the belief. But it seems to me that Hospers, it's as if Hospers says, we've got super doubters. Well, guess what? We can also have super certainty. And again, if that's his point, I don't think he gives us good examples of the super certainty when it comes to, again, the belief that there's an ink bottle in front of me here and now. I mean, after all, people can dream, have vivid dreams. There can be optical illusions. People can even have hallucinations even when they take prescription drugs, right? I've heard people say, including elderly people, that they thought that there were like snakes coming out of someone's knee or out of the floor as a result of prescription drugs. And then we know, whether it's holograms or whether it's other technical manipulation, we know that people's perceptions can be manipulated and also manipulated through drugs and so on. So it just seems to me that if there is knowledge in the strong sense, and there's a real question about whether we should distinguish between knowledge in the strong sense and knowledge in the weak sense, that it wouldn't be any beliefs based on our perception of what is in our immediate physical environments. Okay, so that's what I have to say about the knowledge in the strong sense and knowledge in the weak sense in Hospers. I think Hospers does do a pretty good job of analyzing what it is to have propositional knowledge, and his view is that you have propositional knowledge when you have a true belief that is adequately justified by adequate or sufficient evidence. Okay, and that's a pretty standard definition or analysis of propositional knowledge. Let me say something else. The ancient Greeks, many of them were saying knowledge is justified true belief, and then we get into the question of when something's justified. But that sort of analysis is a pretty common analysis, and he believes that if we follow it carefully, we'll realize, that we have all sorts of knowledge, though sometimes we're mistaken about things that we feel quite sure of. And that's any adequate definition of knowledge ought to include the possibility that sometimes we're incorrect about what we think we know, because we know that many people are incorrect about what they think they know. I happen to have a book on that issue called Sorry, Wrong Answer that's just filled with popular misconceptions. But in any event, so let us just say right now that Hospers is saying that if you understand the analysis of knowledge, of propositional knowledge, and if you understand that just as knowledge requires grounds, so does doubt. Okay, and not anything, according to Hospers, can constitute grounds for knowledge, and especially grounds to undercut and override and to destroy, really, beliefs that seem to be very, very well substantiated, such as a belief that rocks exist. Okay? So Hospers is saying that if there's some belief that is for which we have an enormous amount of evidence, such as that rocks exist, you're going to need a very strong ground for doubt to overturn that. And the ground for doubt, according to Hospers, cannot be simply something that is a product of your imagination. You're saying, well, how do I know that there's not some brain scientist fooling me into thinking that rocks are real when they don't exist? Well, Hospers would say, well, that's not good enough, because we have all sorts of evidence that rocks exist. We don't have adequate evidence for believing in this duplicitous brain scientist. The evidence simply isn't there. It's not there. And if you say, well, it could be the case that there is such a scientist who just happens to be undetectable, he would say that is a doubt that doesn't have sufficient backing. That's what Hospers would say. And I think Hospers could say that without drawing the distinction between knowledge in the strong sense and knowledge in the weak sense. I just don't think, that's my opinion though, but I just don't think it adds very much to his argument. I really don't. And moreover, I don't think that the examples that he's approving of for knowledge in a strong sense are good examples of things that we're entitled to believe regardless of future evidence. I really don't believe that. And so I think the way he's using the distinction between knowledge in a strong sense and weak sense, and especially the examples also that he is approving of, I don't think those things improve his essay, frankly. I think, but I do agree, again, for what it's worth, I do agree with his idea that just as knowledge requires grounds, so does doubt. I agree with that. And then the question is, well, what can constitute adequate grounds for doubt? Again, normally you would think that the stronger the evidence and the more widespread evidence you have for something, the stronger the counter evidence has to be for you to give up that belief. And here's what's interesting about radical skepticism. Okay? You would think that there's ample evidence that rocks exist, but here's what happens with radical skeptics. Radical skeptics will say that you can have all what you call the evidence, all that you want, and yet it'll never be good enough. And we can know that independently of even examining your evidence, because we know what your evidence is based on. In the case of the physical world, it's based on sense experience. And then they're going to say, we're going to give you a ground for doubting all sense experience, for thinking that all of it could be bogus, or that at any given time, any of it could be bogus. And if we don't know at any given time that we are that our evidence is not bogus, we don't know with absolute certainty that it's not bogus, then we can't know. That's the position of the radical skeptic. So the radical skeptic says, in a sense, the radical skeptic says, I don't care how many people say they know that rocks exist or have had rocks, what they think rocks thrown at them, and had the resultant damage. They go, I don't care. I don't care how many scientists have examined rocks. In fact, radical skepticism is so radical that it's not even clear that if you're a radical skeptic, you would be entitled to believe there are other people around, or even that you know you have a body. Okay, so if you tell a radical skeptic, well, look at all these scientists, the radical skeptic, well, what scientists, right? In philosophy, there's something called solipsism, self-aloneism. And there's a medical physical version of it, and that's the belief that all that exists is the self and its mental contents. And then that's the metaphysical version. Then there's an epistemological version of it that says that's all that someone can know. That is, one can know that one exists and the contents of one's mind. That's the most that one can know with certainty. Right? And some people have questioned whether Descartes, who starts with somebody calls this the egocentric predicament, right? Because he starts from the self and he tries to work out, and he says that what he most knows is the contents of his own mind, and that he exists as a thinker, right? And so there's always been a question about whether you can actually build a theory of knowledge believing that what is absolutely certain is your own ego and then whether you can go beyond that. And there's even a question of, well, also especially about whether Descartes successfully negotiated himself out of skepticism, and the way he did it, and I'm not going to go into it right now, but the way he did it was trying to prove that God existed, and that's a tricky thing, especially for someone who doesn't want to appeal to sense experience to try to prove that God exists. So he had to do it in other ways, and or try to do it in other ways. But in any event, I want you to, again, we get back to Descartes. But the key thing I want you to understand is that Unger is a radical skeptic. That is to say, he's not like Descartes, using skepticism as a method to arrive at knowledge. He's saying that if you begin in skepticism of the kind he's advocating, you'll never be able to argue your way out of it. Now, some people think that's a good thing because it makes us more modest in our knowledge claims. But other people think it's too excessive, that we must know more than he says we could possibly know. Because remember, his view is if you could possibly be mistaken about something, you can't know it. Hospers says that that's not the case. Now, remember, when Hospers talks about knowledge in the weak sense, and again, for Hospers, most of our knowledge, most of it, is knowledge in the weak sense. It's something that, even if it's correct, we could theoretically be shown to be mistaken. Okay, so again, remember that for Hospers, most knowledge is knowledge in the weak sense. But again, Hospers believes that you have propositional knowledge when you have a true belief that is justified by adequate or sufficient evidence. And he thinks we often have that. Okay, here's what I want to say. I think Hospers and Unger can agree on the basic conditions for propositional knowledge. But here's what's going to happen. They're going to disagree over whether all those conditions are met. We've talked about those three conditions. And in particular, Unger is going to say we cannot say we know that we have adequate or sufficient evidence for believing what we claim to know. And in the case of rocks, okay, not just one thing, but it represents knowledge of the physical world. Remember that Unger says we cannot know with certainty that rocks exist, because if we knew with certainty that rocks exist, we'd have to know with certainty that we couldn't possibly be mistaken about their existence. Now remember, Hospers says that knowledge in the weak sense is knowledge, and it's something about which you could theoretically be mistaken. Now, of course, if you are mistaken, let me give you an example. Let's take the example that one of the examples that Hospers gives, and that is as he's looking at his books in his office, his knowledge in a strong sense, he goes down the hallway for several minutes. He could come back and the books may not be there. In that case, the belief that the books were still there, obviously, it wouldn't even constitute knowledge because it would be false. So if you do have what you think is knowledge in the weak sense, but then you find out that it's incorrect, it's not any kind of knowledge at all. Okay. But the point is, Hospers is not saying that if you know anything, it has to be something concerning which you can't be mistaken. By the way, the only thing he talks about, and it's a minority of knowledge, he does say knowledge in the strong sense is a belief you're entitled to hold regardless of future evidence. But in general, knowledge doesn't have to be something concerning which you couldn't be possibly mistaken for Hospers. Rather, it has to be a true belief that's based on adequate or sufficient evidence. So again, let me give you an example that I like to give. If you are watching this video and you're awake and you believe that, you're correct about it, and you have what was normally adequate evidence, then Hospers would say you know that you're watching the video and you're awake. You know that. Whereas Unger would say no. In fact, he would say you can't even know technically that there's a video. You can't even know that you have a body. You can't know any of that. I mean, because it's at least theoretically possible that you're mistaken. See? So they're obviously going to disagree about whether we have whether all three of those conditions are met, the conditions of propositional knowledge. Because what's going to happen is that Hospers is going to say, well, they're often met when we're talking, for example, about the physical world. And Hospers is going to say, Hospers say they're often met. Unger's going to say they're never met because we're not going to be in a position to say with certainty that we have sufficient evidence for believing anything about the physical world, including that rocks exist. Now again, I'm hoping that this will be helpful to you, this video lecture. I suggest again that you do the readings. I definitely think you should look very carefully at the lecture notes for each lecture. And again, a lot of people find it convenient to look at the written lecture notes before doing the readings, or looking at the video first. But in any event, I do think that you need to ideally look at all three, think about all three. The beauty of the written stuff and the video is that you can continue to go over the stuff. And again, I hope you find this stuff helpful in understanding the readings. That pretty much covers what I wanted to cover today.